to thank Jack Souter, who sang the soloist there, and Dolores Burris, who sang the soloist during the offertory. How reliable is the word of your friends? Have you ever really thought about that? When you begin to think of your acquaintances, people with whom you work, friends, relatives, how reliable is their word? An interesting question came up the other day. The Wolfendens are providing my eyes for the Wednesday evening series I'm doing, and when we came back to the house, somehow or another we got talking about the new lottery. And I said in the course of the conversation to Sarah, what would happen if I gave you 50 cents towards the dollar and you said to me, I'll split the winnings and then won $1 million? Would you really give me $500,000? That's an interesting question, isn't it? There are no legal documents. There's no carefully spelled out working relationship. It's a word of two people that said, I will do this. And it's fine. Almost everybody would split a $2 winner. Most would split a 5. 10 would start to get a little touchy. 10,000 would put pressure on. But $1 million, how many of your friends would you say openly and freely to them, I'll take the chance without anything else that we'll split? Just on their word, their say-so. Well, let's ask it again. How many of you would split it? You're not legally required to. It's $500,000 you're giving up just on the fact that you were playing a game and said, I'll do it. How good is your word when it comes to something like this? How many times do you promise without doing? How many obligations do you accept without fulfilling? How many times do you use the word as a means to avoid rather than to accomplish? Yeah, Dad, I'll do that just because he'll get off my back and then go on and forget about it. Yeah? Well, you see, we've gotten into a world where the word doesn't mean much. We still have the myth that his handshake is as good as anything in the world, but nobody, literally in his right mind, enters into those kinds of relationships anymore. Because the legal problems and the financial problems and what happens with rare occasion indicate that one better nail it down very, very carefully. And I can remember the first time I was engaged with the legal battles. It was a battle in terms of a building. I was working with a very, very competent and one of the best lawyers in the city of Detroit, who fortunately was representing the side I was on in this particular thing. I read a contract he had drawn, and I said to him, I could break that contract. He said, what you must learn, my young friend, is every contract can be broken. That's interesting, because you see, ultimately it does come down to what's the value of the word. And are you willing to stand behind the intent of what you say, even though legally there may be ways out of it? I wanted to have us think about this a little bit because I think it's extremely important to know that we as Congregationalists, along with some of the other churches, are called the people of the covenant. And unless you understand the importance of the word and the importance of the promise and the importance of standing behind what you yourself pledge, you'll never understand why we're the people of the covenant or what the relationship means. In the Old Testament, there were many covenants spelled out. One of the most important was that of the Ten Commandments, which is a form of covenant. It is drawn, quite honestly, from other historical sources, not only in terms of content, but in terms of form. The ancient Hittites up in Asia Minor, Turkey, where we've been having some problems of recent note, the ancient Hittites had a very carefully worked out treaty relationship. There was a preamble in which the king of the Hittites, the most powerful king of that whole area, would say to the other peoples under his jurisdiction, I, the king of the Hittites, have strengthened your borders, have given you wells, have given you free travel, have done things for you which nobody else has ever done. That was the preamble. Then he would go on and spell out all of the various things he had done for them to show that he was a man of courage and of goodwill. Following that, he would have some stipulations. Because I have done these things, you shall not make any other allegiance with other countries. You shall not rebel against me. You shall be faithful unto me. And then he would have witnesses who would sign it, and there would be some series of blessings if you do it, and curses if you don't, and ultimately it was signed by an oath. Look at it very, very quickly. In the Ten Commandments, you have a preamble. I, Yahweh, your God, brought you up out of Israel. I, the king of the Hittites, did this for you. Because I brought you up out of Egypt into Israel and gave you these things, showing you how marvelous I've been unto you. You and your fathers are witnesses to what I have done. If you follow my teachings, these are all quotes out of the Bible, you shall live long in the land. And then there was an oath which was given. Now it's interesting when you begin to look at this kind of a thing that in the political sphere there were always powers. It was not only the word which was important, but the number of soldiers that you had. I resist, because of time, getting into modern politics, which have much of the same kind of preambles, relationships, and ultimately coming down to the power. But there was always an external threat. If you do not do these things, I have the power to annihilate you, which was literally the power of the Hittites over and against the sovereign states. But when it came to the biblical record, while God admittedly had the power, it ultimately came down to a relationship of promise between man and God. In the New Testament, Jesus continued, for the word testament really means covenant, a new covenant. He said, where two or three are gathered together in my name, I'll be there in the midst of them. The early church began to move away from the concept of covenant because they recognized that where people gathered together in the name of and pledged support one to the other, they were forming a distinctive, completely whole society which was separate from the rest of society. And under Roman rule, you could not belong to a secret society except by taking the chance of facing the penalty of death. So the new church, as it became Roman, that is, as it moved into Rome and as it moved into Greece, began to turn away from the concept of the relationship they had one with the other under God, and spelled it out in different terminology. But the New Testament itself, born as it was in Palestine and growing out of the experience of the Jewish members of it, held very tightly to the concept of covenant, testament, pledge. We pledge one with the other to do certain kinds of things. And we recognize that where God is and where we are gathered in God's name, the obligation of God is there, but the obligation of our own membership is to be found there. For a long period of time, as you well recognize, there was a time in history in which the so-called Protestant or separatist or the free church movement was lost. And then it began to reassert itself. Our forebears were German, and to a certain degree, and when we do our series of lectures on our congregational history, we'll tie it all together. But they were the Anabaptists. They were the people who held to a covenant relationship, that there were no bishops, that there was no church authority, that the only authority to be found in the church was to be found in the hands of the people who coveted together and joined together for worship, for fellowship, for outreach. There was no outside authority that could make the church do anything. It was completely and totally in the hands of the membership itself. When they were driven out of Germany during a time of persecution, they came to England, dear sweet England, land of the free, where they were burned at the stake, because they dared to say that the covenant, the relationship, the secret society, quote unquote, of believers under God committing themselves to each other was too dangerous to the throne. Some of them became Baptists, some of them became Congregationalists, and the history of the separation continued. But it's interesting that when the Cambridge Platform of the Congregationalists was drawn up in 1649, they called themselves as part of that platform, "This form is the visible covenant, agreement, consent, whereby we give ourselves up to the Lord, to the observing of the ordinances of Christ, together in the same society which is usually called the church covenant." Well, the reason I do all this very, very quickly, and that's basically all I want to say to you, is this: how good is your word? After 15 years, how willing are you to still say, we enter into covenant with the Lord and with each other as a church, submitting to its order and discipline, supporting its services, and walking together in the ways of the Lord? There is no external pressure. You will never receive a summons from the court saying you made a pledge and didn't pay. There is nobody who really knows how deep or how severe your commitment and the problems you face. You know it only within yourself. But the interesting thing about the people of the covenant is that the challenge is for you to continually reevaluate your word. Would you split $250,000 or $500,000 or $1 million just on the basis that you said so? Are you of that kind of persuasion that having made a promise will continue it? We enter into a promissory relationship with the Lord and with one another. The obligation is clear. Because one of the things that we found as we began to study and as I began to read over the past week and rethink all of these things on the covenant is that it doesn't really matter whether I always agree. That's part of the freedom to disagree. And we shall have a sermon on freedom coming up. It doesn't matter whether I think the faith is always the way I want it to be. We shall have understanding of faith together. That's one of the sermons coming up. It doesn't mean that there aren't times when I get madder than blazes at somebody in this congregation, as they do with me, but our real fellowship is coming up. And we're going to talk about that. Because fellowship transcends that kind of difference. What it does mean is that my responsibility to you is not out of a salary, is not out of a physical relationship, is not out of a relationship where you call me as pastor, but because I stood up here and said to you at the same time you said to me, we enter into covenant with the Lord and with each other. I hope on the 15th anniversary, Jim Lyons will reread that covenant many times and so much make it a part of his heart that he recognizes his obligations to God and to our common fellowship, to support its services, to walk in its ways, to submit to the congregation, and to understand with the full recognition that we pledge ourselves to fulfill Christ's law. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy strength, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. 15 years from now, if you were to hear this sermon, could you say, I kept faith with my word under God to my friends in our covenant?